everyone, today we are going to focus on our cerebral hemispheres, our section 12.2. The cerebral hemispheres account for about 83% of our brain's total mass. When we think of our brain, the hemispheres are the part that we see the cerebral hemispheres. So they're going to be full of grooves and ridges. So the higher points, these ridges, are going to be called the gyri, or the plural gyrus. And then finally we have sulci, so these shallow grooves, or sulcuses. So if they're really, really deep grooves, they're called fissures. We're going to have a longitudinal fissure that's going to separate the two hemispheres, and then we have a transverse cerebral fissure, which separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. So if we look at our brain here, so here's an actual picture of a human brain, we can see the gyri here, the larger parts, and then the sulci are these deep grooves. So several sulci are going to divide each hemisphere into 5 lobes, and these should all sound very familiar because they are going to be named after the skull bones that overlie them, with the exception of the insula. So we have a frontal lobe, a parietal lobe, a temporal lobe, and an occipital lobe. The insula is going to be buried kind of deep underneath the temporal, the parietal, and the frontal lobes. So here's a lateral view. If we're looking at the different lobes here, you can see they are separated by these dotted lines. So the frontal lobe here covered by our frontal bone, the temporal bone on the side here, the occipital lobe here in the back, and parietal lobe on the side. And there's our temporal lobe here. So the other thing that we can see from this is the transverse cerebral fissure. So let me take these away real quick. You can see this super, super deep groove right here. So that's a great example of a fissure. Okay. And then if we want to look at these a little bit further divided, helps to have it a little color-coded. If we take a cross-section or a little chunk out of the cerebral hemisphere, we can see the gyrus at the top, or the ridge, and then we've got a sulci. It's kind of covered by gray matter here, and then white matter deep to that. So we remember white matter, highly myelinated, gray matter, not so much myelin. Okay. And then finally, if we were to peel back those outer layers of the frontal, the parietal, and the temporal lobe is where we're going to see the insula deep in here. Okay. So these major sulci are going to divide our lobes. So we have the central sulcus is going to separate the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe and the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe. We also have a parietal occipital sulcus. It's going to separate the occipital and the parietal lobes, and the lateral sulcus is going to outline the temporal bones. So each hemisphere has 3 basic regions. We have the cerebral cortex, is that superficial gray matter, the internal white matter, and then we have basal nuclei, which are going to be embedded deep within the white matter. So our cerebral cortex is the executive suite of the brain. So it's going to be our site of the conscious mind, our awareness, our sensory perception, voluntary motor initiation, communication, memory storage, and understanding. So incredibly important, all of the capabilities of our cerebral cortex. It's super thin, about 2 to 4 millimeters of that gray matter. It's composed mostly of neuron cell bodies, dendrites, glial cells, blood vessels, but has 0 axons, and also accounts for about 40% of the mass of our brain. Now, if we were to look at functional imaging in a PET scan or an MRI, our brain is going to show specific motor and sensory functions. So these are going to be located in discrete areas of the brain called domains. Our higher functions are going to be spread over many areas. So if we were to look at a functional MRI, meaning they do an MRI with testing different things, like maybe asking someone to listen to classical music or having them think about a math problem. So that's what we're getting with these different tasks right here. So we can see that seeing is located in our occipital lobe. Hearing is going to be in our temporal lobe. Speaking has its own highly specific area on the lateral side, and then we can see that thinking occurs in a lot of different parts of our brain depending on what the task is. So 4 general considerations of our cerebral cortex. We basically have 3 types of functional areas. We have a motor area, which is going to control voluntary movement, a sensory area, which is conscious awareness of some type of sensation. So when we think about our 5 senses, such as hearing, sight, taste, that's where that's going to occur. And then these association areas, which is where we integrate a lot of different information to make sense of what is being input. So each hemisphere is going to be concerned with a contralateral or opposite side of the body. So something in the right side of the brain is going to affect the left side of the body and vice versa. So this lateralization of certain functions can occur only in one hemisphere, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the chapter because it's actually pretty cool, interesting information. Conscious behavior is going to involve the entire cortex in one way or another. So these motor areas, they're going to be located in the frontal lobe, or the frontal half of our brain. So it's going to act to control voluntary movement. This happens in the primary motor cortex and the precentral gyrus. So precentral just before the center of the gyrus. The premotor cortex is going to be anterior to the precentral gyrus. We also have Broca's area, which is going to be anterior to the inferior premotor area. And we're going to hit on that a little bit as well. And then we have the frontal eye field. So this is going to be just on top of Broca's area. So if we were to look at this motor section right here, so we have this central sulcus. Okay, so this is separating, see our sensory area starts here, motor area in here. So here's our premotor cortex down in here. This is this Broca's area, which is outlined by the dashes right down here. There we go. Working memory for spatial tasks, executive area for task management, working memory, solving complex problems. So a lot of our motor skills, and really important motor skills, I should say, are going to come from the frontal part of our brain. So this primary or somatic motor cortex, remember soma meaning body, is located in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. We have what are called pyramidal cells. So these are large neurons that allow conscious control of precise, skilled skeletal muscle movements, so repetitive things that you do. These pyramidal tracts, we're going to talk about them a little bit later on too, are formed from long axons that project down into the spinal cord, so making movement happen. Somatotopy is all muscles can be mapped to an area on our primary motor cortex. So what that means is each specific part of that motor cortex is going to correspond to a body part. We have a chart or a map, what's called our motor homunculus, or homunculi meaning little man. It's basically a drawing, kind of a caricature to represent these areas in our brain, and they're going to work contralaterally. So if we're looking at the left side of the brain, it's going to control the right side of the body. So I have always been a little terrified of this motor homunculus. It looks extra crazy if you can see this. So what we're looking at here is just a cross section of the brain. So we're actually looking at it backwards. This is the anterior posterior part here. So this would be anterior posterior up here. So we can see these larger areas, or I shouldn't say large areas, but areas such as our nose, our face, our lips are going to take up a larger part of this motor area because they are so highly controlled. You know, we can make very fine facial movements, we can move our eyes, we can do a lot of things that aren't gross motor movements like just moving your arms up and down. So those areas are going to control a larger part of that brain. We see smaller areas, intra-abdominal, doesn't really require a lot of fine motor control. Tongue, teeth, and gums take up a little part. We can see our foot and our knee here. And again, like face taking up a really, really large part of this. Okay, moving on. If we look at the premotor cortex, this helps us plan our movements. So the staging area, or we set up for skilled motor activities. So where controls are learned, repetitions, patterns, motor skills like shooting a free throw, swinging a baseball bat, this is where this occurs. So it coordinates simultaneous or sequential actions. So we know that pitching a baseball isn't just one movement from our wrist. It takes this sequence starting all the way from our hips, shoulders, elbows, and then finally the wrist. It also controls voluntary action that is dependent on sensory feedback. So getting something right, a lot of repetition to make a perfect pattern. So this Broca's area that we talked about, this is present in one hemisphere. I say usually the left, and we'll kind of talk about that a little bit. Usually it seems like that's kind of arbitrary. It should either be one or the other, but it's not the same in every person. This is where motor speech area that directs the muscles of speech production happens. So how you are actually able to form and say the words. That's not understanding language. That's merely being able to articulate and to speak and to put those muscles and sounds together. If damage to Broca's area would render someone unable to communicate. So this is involved in active planning speech and voluntary motor activities. So if you ever find yourself having a conversation with somebody, or I know a lot of people that like their mouth is moving while you're talking and they're ready to get their next point out, this is also active during that time. So even though you might not be speaking, Broca's area is still starting to plan what you're about to say. Our frontal eye field obviously is going to control the voluntary movements of our eyes. So being able to look left, right, up and down, not necessarily blinking. Okay, so just to point out again for you, we have Broca's area right here. And our frontal eye field coming in there as well. Okay, that's just a lateral view. So what this diagram is showing us is the primary motor cortex in bright red here. We have the motor association cortex going to be in our like salmon color. The multimodal association cortex, so different modes. We'll get there as well. Okay. Damage to the areas of the primary motor cortex. We will see in a stroke, which paralyzes the muscles controlled by that area. So we know that paralysis also is going to occur on the opposite side. So if the stroke takes place on the left side, the right side will be unable to move, and vice versa. Now, muscle strength or ability to perform discrete individual movements is not impaired, only control over those movements is lost. So damage to the premotor area that controls the movements of your finger would still allow your fingers to move, but that voluntary control needed to do something like type or use chopsticks would be lost during the stroke. So other premotor neurons can be reprogrammed to take over that specific skill, but it requires practice, just like it did when you first learned to do those things. So think about, being a young kid, learning how to type. You would have to learn that over again, which is why physical therapy is super important following a stroke. Okay, so if we talk about our sensory areas, so these are going to be the areas of the cortex that are concerned with conscious, aware sensations. So those sensations that we have conscious control over: heat, touch, sound, taste, all of those occur in here. So they're going to be in our parietal, insular, temporal, and our occipital lobes. So these areas are going to be the primary somatosensory cortex, the somatosensory association cortex, our visual areas, auditory or hearing areas, vestibular, which controls our balance, olfactory cortex, the gustatory cortex, and the visceral sensory area. So remember, viscera being our internal organs. So the primary somatosensory cortex is going to be located in the postcentral gyrate of the parietal lobe, so just posterior. So it's going to receive general information from our skin and those proprioceptors. So proprioceptors, we have them all over the place. We have them in our skin, we have them in skeletal muscles, joints, and tendons. So when you feel a joint being hyperextended or stretched beyond what it should be, that is going to send, those proprioceptors are going to send information back to your CNS. So this also helps us to be capable of spatial discrimination, so identifying which area of your body that is in. So if a bug lands on your right arm, your brain can automatically identify that this is coming from this exact area on my arm, not from the opposite side. We also have a somatosensory homunculus, so almost looks exactly the same to our motor homunculus. If we take a look at him here, we can see these areas that have high amounts of sensitivity. So nose, face, lips, those areas that have a lot of sensory nerve endings are going to get a larger part of our brain here. Some that are not so large, like shoulders, trunk, hip, they're not going to take up a larger space on our homunculus. Okay, so this somatosensory association cortex is going to sit posterior to the primary somatosensory cortex, so just behind that. So it's going to integrate our sensory input, things like temperature or pressure, from the cortex to understand an object. So these are going to help us determine size, texture, relationship of parts or an object being felt. I know that I can reach into my pocket and I can know that that is my chapstick, or those are my specific keys because they draw on past experiences or exactly what that feels like in your pocket. So even though you don't see it, you know exactly what it is, and that is because of our somatosensory association cortex. So these visual areas, so we have a primary visual area located on the extreme posterior tip of the occipital lobe. So it is going to receive the visual information from our retinas. This is going to be our largest cortical sensory area. So it takes up a huge chunk of that occipital lobe. It's going to receive input from the opposite side of the body too. So information is getting crisscrossed in your brain. What is seen with your right eye is being interpreted from the left side and vice versa. So it seems kind of strange that this information coming right from our eyes isn't necessarily interpreted in that part of the brain, the most anterior part that sits right behind our eyes. It actually goes all the way to the back in order to interpret what we're seeing. The visual association area surrounds this primary visual cortex to help it recognize what you're seeing. So it uses our past experience to interpret visual stimuli. So color, shape, movement of something. It also explains our ability to recognize faces because it's something that we've seen in a past visual experience. So this obviously is a really complex process that involves almost the entire back half of your brain. It's highly involved, a lot that goes on with that. When we get into the special senses, we'll discuss that a little bit more in depth as well.